It won't take like 4 months like it did last time, because the reason why that took so long was because I procrastinated for a really long time. Hi, I'm Bluesu, and I really like Gravity Falls, a groundbreaking and never-seen-before opinion. For those who don't know, or for those who just need a recap, Gravity Falls was a 2-season-long Disney cartoon about Dipper and Mabel Pines, a pair of twins who were sent to live with their great-uncle, or grunkle Stan, during summer break. They soon realized that Gravity Falls is more than just a town of tourist traps, cheap diners, and whatever the hell Toby determined is, and is instead filled with supernatural creatures like gnomes, cults, and interdimensional triangles. Every episode is about a different supernatural occurrence, and I don't know why I'm telling you this. The show's been out for 10 years. You should have watched it by now. It's great. Come on. This show is really important to me growing up and shaped a lot of my tastes in media going forward in life. It's got the actual funny jokes, the fun character dynamics, the emotional damage, the disturbing imagery that looks like it comes from hell, J.K. Simmons somehow.
Am I to understand that you cannot read tempo? Can you even fucking read music?
Anything you could possibly want in the show. So as a kid, it's no wonder I was drawn to it. Mabel and Dipper were always the ones I related to the most, since I was an itty-bitty baby when I first watched this show, and the twins are similarly itty-bitty babies. Mabel was a lot like how I was in elementary school. Energetic, obsessed with arts and crafts, an avid stuffed animal lover, social. Where did the years go? Meanwhile, Dipper was the one I related to the most once I got into middle school, and is probably still the character I relate the most to now. His introverted and kinda antisocial behavior, his immense passion for things like the journal, his awkwardness, his tendency to overthink things, he's just like me for real. But as much as I related to the Pines twins in this show, I never really connected with the other Pines twins. The Pine twins OGs themselves, Stan and Ford. The guys who were so twins, they didn't even get their own separate names. I'm sure that didn't lead to any kind of over-attachment or resentment down the road. While Dipper and Mabel's arcs were more about coming into their own and dealing with the change that teenagehood and eventually adulthood would bring, Stan and Ford have basically already come into their own. These are grown-ass old men. Look at those eye bags and graying hair. Their arcs dealt more with actual adult issues like surviving on your own after being kicked out or dealing with an abusive relationship. And because of that, I never really started connecting with them until I got older. But here I am now. Older. Now, Grunkle Stan is probably the character I relate the least to out of the entire cast. I love him, but I can't say I've ever committed tax fraud or illegally shipped pugs across the US border. When it comes to Ford, whoo boy, I've got thoughts. One of the biggest headcanons for Ford's character is that he's queer, and this headcanon has been further popularized after the release of the Book of Bill and the... Well, okay, is it even subtext at this point? At what point does subtext just become text? I mean, look at this. And the interpretation of Stan as queer has recently been at the forefront of my mind after reading Journal 3 in the Book of Bill myself, as well as watching various queer analyses of Gravity Falls as a whole. Shout out to Hannah Hyperfixates, whose queer analysis of Gravity Falls semi-inspired me to make this video, and you should watch all of their videos right now. Yes, even the one where they rank different bills based on how hot they are for over an hour. It's a banger, trust me. But yeah, the fact that Stanford might be queer is a pretty popular interpretation. But while most people have been quick to label him as gay or bi, I came out with, whilst a not unheard of interpretation, one that I feel hasn't been discussed as much. So before we get into this, there's probably something I should mention. I am an aromantic asexual, specifically an arospec asexual. For those who don't know, asexuality is a sexual orientation where one doesn't feel sexual attraction, and aromanticism is the same but for romantic attraction. Both of these exist on spectrums and can be experienced in a lot of different ways, and they can also be experienced separately. You can be asexual but not aromantic, and you can be aromantic but not asexual. If you want to learn more, I'll put some links in the description for you to check out. But for me personally, all I'll say is that whilst I am fully asexual, my romantic orientation is a bit of a hot mess. So for now, I'll just say that I'm on the aromantic spectrum since that's the most accurate way I can describe it. With all that being said, as well as using your eyeballs to read the title of this video, I think you can probably guess my interpretation of Ford. I think the story of Stanford Pines is one that can be easily read as an aro-ace story, and the things he goes through reflect the ways in which being aro-ace conflicts with society. Now I want to make this clear. This video isn't me trying to prove that Ford is aro-ace. If I wanted to do that, then I'd just show you this quote, or talk about how Bill calls him romantically challenged, or show you how, in the Book of Bill, it's confirmed that Ford regularly dreams about a quiz that asks him what he's attracted to, and he always answers logic and preparation. Not sure what to call that plan sexual? All that aside, this video is going to be more so a retelling of Ford's story through the perspective of an Aro Ace person, and how his arc mirrors the struggles that come from being Aro Ace, rather than definitive proof of his orientation. We'll be going through all the stages of his life, from childhood to late adulthood, and see how his life can be reinterpreted through the lens of being Aro Ace. A couple of things before getting into this analysis though. One, and this should go without saying, but this is not me trying to invalidate other people's interpretations of Stanford Pines. If you see him as gay, or bi, or hell even straight, you're a real rare one, then that's fine. We can all have our interpretations of this fictional cartoon character and hold hands and do backflips together. I don't want to see any comments. Two, whilst I'm calling this an Aro Ace reading of Ford, this is going to be mostly focused on the Aromantic side of things. I'll be using the label Aro Ace throughout this video because that's what I am, and this entire video is just me projecting on a fictional old man. In addition, for the duration of this video, I'm going to be using the label Aro Ace as an umbrella term for anyone part of either of those communities, mostly just for conciseness. Whilst I know that aromanticism and asexuality are not interchangeable, I welcome anyone part of either of those communities on any part of their spectrums to identify with this video if they want. And lastly, on that topic, this video is going to be based off of my experience being Aro Ace. The aromantic and asexual communities are not monoliths, and I don't claim to represent every single one of them. That would honestly be ridiculous. Have you seen how big the spectrum is? There's so many of you. Not everyone will probably relate to this, and that's okay. We're all little guys with our own little lives that are all unique in their own ways, and I think that's beautiful. And so with all that being said, let's get into the video. Let's do an Aro Ace reading of Stanford Pines. From the moment he was born, Ford was strange. He says as much himself in the journal.
To put it simply, I am strange. I was born strange. I am attracted to the strange, and the strange has always been attracted to me.
Growing up with 2 extra appendages on both his hands would have been enough to put him in the weird box, but he was also socially awkward and didn't seem to mesh with anyone except for his brother. Growing up feeling weird and ostracized from society is probably something all queer people can relate to, and is one of the first indicators that drives people to form queer interpretations of Ford. One thing that resonates with my experience with being Aro Ace is the expectation of romance, even at a very young age. We live in a society that assumes romance and eventually sex from everyone. For many people, these two things are fundamental to being human, and even in childhood when sex isn't necessarily part of the equation yet, the expectation of romantic attraction is very present. Let's say that you're playing truth or dare with your friends at a sleepover, and you pick truth because you're a coward who doesn't want your subsequent life choices being decided by a bunch of 7-year-old children. What's the #1 question that kids always ask you when you pick truth? Who do you have a crush on? You're expected to have an answer, and if you don't, then there's always a bit of disappointment or confusion in the air. And don't get me started on male and female friendships at that age. It's almost impossible to keep friends from the opposite gender as a kid because everyone, from kids to adults, who should know better, tend to project a romantic lens on it. I swear to God, if I have to hear that stupid-ass sitting in a tree KISSING song one more time, I'm going to punt a 5-year-old into the sun. When romance is something expected of you from that early of an age, it can feel isolating when that's not something you're capable of, and that's not something you necessarily want. But heteronormativity always finds a way, so let's talk about Kathy Crenshaw. For any Gravity Falls fan who hasn't read Journal 3, one question is probably going through your head right now. Who the fuck is Kathy Crenshaw? In Journal 3, Kathy Crenshaw is presumably a childhood crush of Ford's whose hand he attempted to hold. She screamed, which is implied to be because of Ford's 6 fingers. Now, if we're looking at this allegorically and we wanted to go for an Aro Ace interpretation of the character, then we could definitely extrapolate something from the symbol of Ford's abnormality being what distances himself from romance. But looking at this on a surface level, this seems to debunk the whole thing, right? I'm interpreting Ford as Aro Ace, but how can he be Aro Ace if romance? Canon crush right there, theory over. Well, to begin with, that's not how queer analysis works. What is queer media interpretation if not uncomfortably shoving yourself in places that weren't made for you? And like I said, my goal here isn't to confirm with 100% certainty that Ford is Aro Ace. But if we're doing a full Aro Ace reading of the character, then firstly, aromanticism is a spectrum. It's possible that Ford could have been gray romantic or demi-romantic. But secondly, if we wanted to go for a fully aromantic lens, then it's possible that Ford was just trying to conform to what society expected of him. Heteronormativity is a hell of a bitch, and I can tell you for sure that there were plenty of guys I decided I had a crush on because that's what was expected of me. And it's the failure of Kathy Crenshaw that's particularly interesting and what seems to haunt Ford. Let's take this quote from Journal 3.
I was back in school and everyone was staring at my hand. They all kept chanting, 6-fingered freak, 6-fingered freak. The more they chanted, the larger my hand grew. As usual, Kathy Crenshaw was there.
Kathy Crenshaw is directly linked to Ford's feelings of ostracization. It could be that Ford just had a crush and the crush rejected him, but it could also be interpreted as Kathy Crenshaw in and of herself being a failure to conform, being a representation of the childhood romance expected of young children, but that so many are unable to live up to. But that's enough of Kathy Crenshaw. She doesn't even have a character design. What role does Stan play in all this Aromantic nonsense? Well, first off, I don't think that Stan is Aro Ace. It's possible to interpret him that way, but that's a lot more legwork for me. Analyzing one Stan is hard enough. But moving forward, Stan is Ford's only friend. Because of Ford's ostracization from other kids, the only person who ever stood up for him was Stan. They only had each other. And when it comes to being Aro Ace, friendships take a whole nother level of importance than they might have otherwise. This is going to be one of the most important reoccurring threads in this video, which is that of Aro Aceness and its relationship to loneliness. We'll be fully unpacking this in later sections, but for now let's just say that being Aro Ace lends itself well to having an unstable support network due to the way in which society sees relationships. There is no one else in the world who understands Ford. No one else in the world willing to stick up for him. No one else in the world who accepts him for who he is. And Ford knows this.
Listen, dorks, and listen good. You're a six-fingered freak, and you're just a dumber, sweatier version of him. And you're lucky you have each other because neither of you will ever make any friends.
The fact that Stan and Ford are so close as kids might partially have to do with how Ford knows that no one else will be there for him. This friendship is everything to him because the world told him he'll never have anything else. Or at least it did, until it gave him an in. When Stan and Ford reach teenagehood, Ford is offered a golden opportunity. Since he was a kid, Ford's intellectual achievements have been nothing to sneeze at. And all of this intellectual achievement finally gets the attention of Ford's principal after he creates a perpetual motion machine for his science fair. And he offers him the chance to attend one of the best schools in the country, West Coast Tech. Ford's intelligence is something he's always had, but it's only now that it's being recognized in a way that could fundamentally change his life for the better. He's ecstatic when he realizes that his accomplishments could actually lead him somewhere, could actually give him an in to society. And he does see it in that way. Ford sees his intellectual accomplishments as a way to gain acceptance from the rest of the world.
I'm impressed.
He even speaks about it at length in the journal when he's an adult, how his scientific achievements would give him the approval of his family and hometown, finally proving that he isn't just a freak. Now in media, there tends to be a trend of portraying people who aren't interested in sex or romance as intellectual nerds. Peridot, Lilith Clawthorne, fucking Sheldon Cooper, I guess. But I think it's important to talk about why this is the case, because this kind of association leaks outside of media and into the real world. I've had a real-ass person come up to me once and say they thought my Aro Aceness was the reason why they thought I was smart. This is wrong for multiple reasons. One, I'm not smart. But two, sexual orientation obviously has nothing to do with your intelligence level. So why is this association with Aro Aceness and intelligence a thing? When you live in a society that expects romance and sex from the people who live in it, what does that actually mean for the people who don't experience romance, who don't feel sexual attraction? We live in a world where the trajectory of a person's life is expected to collide with sex and romance. People are expected to get married, have kids, have the perfect nuclear family. Traditional romantic relationships are seen as the end-all be-all. Sure, kids will have their friends, but at the end of the day, romance is what's expected to be permanent. Romance is what's expected to last. And people don't bat an eye when people start to prioritize their romantic relationships over their friendships. People don't bat an eye when people's social lives begin and end with their nuclear families. They don't bat an eye when their friends become less a part of their lives. And for a person who will never have a traditional romantic relationship, for a person who will never experience sex or sexual attraction in the expected way, what does that mean for them? Where are they supposed to go? An Aro Ace person is so easy to leave behind. And so the only way to make up for it, the only way for the world to not leave you behind, is to put all you have into your brains, your intellect, the one other thing you know the world values. If the world doesn't see your value without the romance or sexual attraction to back it up, then maybe they could see you as a force of intellect, the best in your field. And the world encourages this search for approval because they believe in it. If a person doesn't feel romantic or sexual attraction, what other life would they even have outside of their work? Ford needs to go to West Coast Tech. It's the one thing that will get the world to notice him, the one thing that will ensure that he will never be left behind. He's set on his goal. He will join the likes of Albert Einstein and Isaac Newton as one of the greatest scientists to ever live. But Sue, what about Stan? You just spent an entire section talking about how close those guys are. If Ford is so concerned about being left behind, why doesn't he stick with Stan? I'll give you that's a pretty good point, but we've got to see Ford as a full human person here. If you've been told your entire life that your brother is the only thing you will ever have, the only thing that will never leave you behind, then you'd probably want a little bit more than that, right? West Coast Tech is Ford's chance to exist outside of his brother, and if he's been living his entire life constantly being compared to him, then of course he'd be ecstatic at the chance to make something more for himself, to have a life outside of his brother. And it's not like he was looking to leave Stan behind completely. He obviously still values his brother's companionship. Hell, he says to Stan that if West Coast Tech doesn't work out, then he'll go on the Stan of War boat trip with him. He wants him to come visit him. He still loves his brother. He still wants him to be a part of his life, just maybe not the only part of his life. People are allowed to be afraid of being left behind, whilst also not wanting to have their entire life be made up of one person, especially if that one person is all the world said they'd ever have. Ford's desire to go to West Coast Tech, make a name for himself, be a genius, can easily be tied to the Arroways experience. The desire to be the smartest, be the best at what you do, can come from the fear of what would happen if you were anything less. And that's why Stan's supposed betrayal hits Ford so hard. Not only is he losing his opportunity to make a name for himself, to go to the school of his dreams, but he's losing it at the hands of his best friend, the person he trusts the most, the one person he was sure would always back him up, would always be on his side. And it probably stings even harder knowing that Ford sees Stan as the social one. In the Book of Bill, he laments about how Stan would have made a waiter he met at the diner laugh. Obviously, Stan isn't that great at social interactions himself, but in Ford's mind, Stan was the one who could make the social connections he lacks. The night when Stan got kicked out, Ford wasn't only losing his chance to be a part of society, he was also losing the one true social connection he had. This was probably one of his lowest moments, knowing that he had no friends and seemingly no into society. With the knowledge of how easily Arrow Ace people are forgotten, he probably thought he was doomed to be alone forever. Obviously, Ford's life didn't end that night when Stan was kicked out. He got into backups more, did exceptionally well in his classes, got one of his projects taken by men in black suits for Ronald Reagan's election, and got the grant money he needed to study his passion, anomalies and cryptids in Gravity Falls, Oregon. After setting up a shack in the woods and preparing to write down his research in a series of journals, Ford started on his mission to uncover the grand unifying theory of weirdness. According to Ford, Gravity Falls is the place with the highest number of anomalies and cryptid sightings in the world, and his main goal was to find out where all the weirdness in Gravity Falls, and by extension the world, came from. The idea of finding this grand unifying theory of weirdness in Gravity Falls that explains all the weirdness that happens there is not only a way of showing Ford's desire to be a great scientist, but also kind of reminds me of when I first found out that I was asexual. Ford says in the journal,
"Perhaps it was luck, perhaps destiny, but I have since found my very own Bermuda Triangle, Gravity Falls, the place where I fit in. It is here that I will find my grand theory and maybe find myself in the process."
He associates finding this grand theory with also finding himself. I think a part of him wanted to not only find an explanation for the weirdness in the world, but to figure out why he was the way that he was, why he was weird. I can't tell you how much time I spent researching asexuality and trying to figure out where it came from and why it existed. And considering Ford is someone who likes figuring stuff out and getting answers, I don't have a hard time believing that this is the perspective he'd adopt about himself. But moving on, yes, finding out the grand unifying theory of weirdness is the goal Ford sets for himself in order to become the great scientist he wants to be. But it seems like he's having trouble going about it alone, and the emotional toll of being completely on his own isn't doing him any favors either. In the Book of Bill, Ford talks about his loneliness.
Is my strange way of seeing the universe a gift or a curse? Is loneliness just the cost of greatness? And if it is, how long am I fated to endure?
Is loneliness the cost of Ford's strange way of seeing the world? I think I've said enough to indicate how that might relate to being Arrow Ace. But Ford isn't going to be alone for that much longer. In fact, there are 2 relationships on the horizon that would define the trajectory of his life going forward. Let's start with Fiddleford. After getting help from a certain someone, Ford comes up with the idea that the main source of all the weirdness in Gravity Falls comes from a separate dimension of weirdness leaking into ours. In order to become the great scientist he desperately wants to be, he starts trying to build a portal to travel to this supposed dimension of weirdness. But apparently, building an extra-dimensional portal to an abstract plane filled with abstract creatures beyond comprehension is hard. So Ford calls up his old college buddy from Backups More, genius inventor Fiddleford Hadron McGucket. Now, there's a lot of ways we could interpret their relationship on Fiddleford's side of things. The dude gave him an axolotl and made his name his computer password. He's beyond saving. But solely looking on Ford's side of things, one thing's for sure. Fiddleford's friendship meant the world to him.
After all these years of self-imposed solitude, how wonderful is it to have a friend by my side. I must do my best to make him feel at home. I'm off to the store for some banjo strings and microchips.
And how could it not? Fiddleford was the first friend he made since Stan, and shared with him a passion for science that not even Stan had. And even within the confines of the text, it is clear that one of the reasons why Ford is so grateful for Fiddleford's company is because of how lonely he was before.
I don't think I realized just how isolated I'd become until F arrived, and his brilliant mind and amusing quirks have made this task infinitely more enjoyable.
Aside from family, which if you're a queer person may not be entirely reliable, friendship is the one other kind of relationship that society offers to them. And if friendship is the only kind of companionship you feel like you're ever gonna get, then you'd sink your teeth into any friend you'd find and never let go, especially if you're someone who isn't great socially. And if that friend does something for you, shows that they appreciate you back, then that can be one of the best things to happen to you. Look at what Ford writes after seeing that Fiddleford came all the way from Palo Alto to help him with his project.
I am overcome with emotion. The sight of my old classmate upon my doorstep this morning filled my heart with such joy and gratitude. He has sacrificed so much to come to my aid. He has temporarily left his bride and their young son behind in California for the duration of this project. He has abandoned his own professional aspirations, although he has brought along a prototype of his pet project to fiddle with in his off hours.
The idea that someone would put their family, their romance, their work aside to help him out is not something he is taking for granted. Obviously, anyone would be grateful to a friend for doing that for them, but for an Arrow Ace Ford specifically, the fear of being left behind, the feeling that romance will always be more important than you, would be completely upended by Fiddleford's act of kindness. This kindness from a friend would mean the world to him. There's a scene in Journal 3 that was one of the main reasons I wanted to make this video. Fiddleford and Ford are outside, looking at the stars together, talking about what they want to do with their lives. Fiddleford talks about becoming an independent inventor and making enough money for a nice place with his family. Ford, however, has other plans in mind.
I discussed my dreams of proving my theory. I'd be the toast of the scientific community. Imagine the look on the Dean of West Coast Tech's face when he saw that the student he refuted was now the next Einstein. Imagine how proud my family and hometown would be. The freak would return a hero. F seemed puzzled by the scope of my plans. I had already discovered so many amazing things and recorded them in my journals. Was this grand theory even necessary? Why not publish now, settle down, maybe meet someone and start a family? I laughed at the thought. Romance was far more baffling to me than the great mysteries of the universe. Wow, Sue, I wonder if this guy is asexual.
Okay, obviously the line, romance is far more baffling to me than the greatest mysteries of the universe, is the most aromantic line I've ever heard in my life. But when looking at this text overall, we get the full picture of Ford's ambitions and why he does the things that he does. Everything he does, trying to prove his grand theory of weirdness, becoming a great scientist on the level of Einstein and Newton. It was all to make his family and the world recognize him, be proud of him. And he can't do what Fiddleford suggests. He can't just settle down. Romance isn't in the cards for him. A normal life, or at least the idea of a normal life that society has given him, isn't in the cards for him. This grand theory is everything. Everything he can be, everything he could be. Because outside of his work, Ford doesn't think he has a life. He doesn't think he can have a life. His work is the only way to prove his worth. When Fiddleford bails on the portal project after falling into the portal after a failed test and getting a glimpse of what's on the other side, Ford is obviously distraught. He doesn't have many friends, and he feels like he's been betrayed once again. And what does he say after Ford leaves him?
Well, good riddance, F, you weak-willed hayseed. Go back to your doting family and a life of fear and compromise. I weep now, not for our failed partnership, but for the golden opportunity thrown away.
Go back to your doting family and a life of fear and compromise. When Ford says this, it feels like he's resentful that Fiddleford is choosing his family over the project, over their partnership. In an Arrow Ace Ford's eyes, this would be his worst fear becoming a reality. Fiddleford, one of his closest friends for years, has chosen his family, his romance, over him. Ford would never be as important as another person's romance. He would always be chosen second, or worst, last. and so he doubles down on his work. He knows his work is the only thing he can depend on. He doesn't need him, he doesn't need anyone. But who's waiting for him on the other side? Alright, fine. Cue the confetti, cue the cheering, it's the moment you've been waiting for. Let's talk about Bill Ford. So obviously I left out some stuff in Fiddleford's section. Whilst Ford and Fiddleford were busy working on the portal, making snowmen, and inventing allegories for drug addiction, Ford was conversing with two-dimensional dream demon himself, Bill Cipher. When Ford was at one of his lowest points and at a dead end regarding his grand unifying theory of weirdness, Bill started lending him a hand in his dreams. He told him that the solution to the theory was that there was a weirdness dimension leaking into his, and in order to have everyone recognize his research and become a great scientist, he would build a portal connecting the two worlds. And Ford is none the wiser to Bill's real plans, which is that in building this portal, it would let Bill into the real world and let him take over the world. More than he already has, I guess. Now, remember at the beginning of this video when I said there was an influx of queer interpretations of Ford after the release of the Book of Bill? Yeah, there's a reason for that. Mabel calling him a needy ex, the love cage, Bill referring to their relationship as a will they won't they take over the universe relationship. There's a lot. And as an Arrow Stanford defender, you're probably wondering how I feel about all this. Well, here's the thing, dear viewer. Romantic, platonic, and sexual love aren't the only kinds of love that exist. Alright, let's explain some stuff. Before I start, I should let you know that we're getting into some kinda muddy territory. The terms Queerplatonic and Alterous can be kind of vague, and different people might have different definitions for it. There's a reason why my romantic orientation is the way that it is. Things can get complicated, and at the end of the day, I just want to talk about elderly cartoon men. So I'm just going to be using my own personal definitions for this video. Love and language are social constructs, and words only carry the meaning we assign to them, blah blah blah. I'll put some links in the description if you want to learn more. Got it? Good. Queerplatonic relationships, or QPRs, can be defined as close, non-romantic relationships that involve a certain level of commitment that traditional friendship might not have. I guess you could say it's an umbrella term for any kind of relationship that exists between traditional friendships and romantic relationships. Because queerplatonic relationships encompass such a wide range of different kinds of relationships with their own rules and terms, there isn't really a standard traditional structure for them. In fact, that lack of traditional structure might be the point. But they're a thing that exists and can be a pretty useful term for a lot of aromantic people who may be interested in a committed relationship but might not want the traditional romance that tends to come with it. Moving forward, Alterous attraction can be defined as a type of attraction that involves wanting a certain emotional closeness with someone, but in a way that can't be defined as platonic or romantic. Another in-between situation. Not everyone in a queerplatonic relationship will necessarily be feeling Alterous attraction for their partner, but it's another useful term for aromantic people who might want a certain emotional closeness with someone that isn't necessarily romantic. Make sense? Cool. If not, I don't care. I'm not spending any more time explaining stuff. Do your own research. But what does any of this have to do with Bill Ford? Am I really advocating for queerplatonic Bill Ford? Is their relationship really a queerplatonic one? Does Ford have an Alterous crush on an extra-dimensional triangle? Maybe? Let's take a look at their relationship as it is within the text. It definitely feels like it has some sort of romantic undertone, but I feel like there's enough wiggle room here to interpret it in different ways. I mean, it's not like Bill described an hour-long makeout session with Ford in the Book of Bill. I don't even know how that would physically work. What we do know about Bill and Ford's relationship is that, at least on Ford's end, they were extremely close. He relies heavily on this relationship since it's basically his only social connection besides Fiddleford, and he thinks very highly of Bill, especially since Bill is the one giving him advice on his grand theory.
It is an idea so pure and powerful, I never could have thought of it on my own. Sometimes I cannot believe how lucky I am to have come across my blessed muse.
And there is some evidence to suggest that Bill had some affection for Ford as well. I mean, after Ford left him, the guy went on a drinking spree and ordered 1 sixer, please. Whatever that dude had, he had it bad. But here's the thing about QPRs and Alterous attraction. They're not things that most people know about. Hell, I'm betting a lot of you watching this video had no idea it existed before watching it. But let's say you are someone who felt a type of attraction that most people don't even know exists. That would probably add to your isolation, to know that you feel something that no one around you has a word for, that no one around you feels themselves. And that's why it can mean the world when you find someone who can make sense of something you never understood, and not only help you make sense of it, but someone who seems to feel the same way. Even within the text itself, it is clear that Bill is taking advantage of Ford's loneliness and his ostracization from society in order to get close to and manipulate him. And what better way to take advantage of a vulnerable target than offering them the thing they thought they'd never get, an understanding of what they feel and a relationship that no one else in society seems to be able to offer. And in Ford's eyes, who other than an extra-dimensional and seemingly divine being would be able to understand what Ford is going through? Who else would be able to understand the kinds of relationships and attraction that no one else except him seems to understand? And it would add to Ford's desire to keep the relationship under wraps. Not only was he conferring with a talking triangle in a top hat in his free time, but the relationship itself was something he probably thought no one would be able to understand.
Could F ever truly appreciate the complex fates that brought me and my muse together?
Now obviously if Bill Ford was a QPR, then it would be an incredibly toxic one. And hey, look at me. I do not want people to leave this video with the idea that all QPRs are inherently toxic or something stupid like that. I know most of you are probably smart enough to not believe that, but there's always one of you, and I'm not letting you off the hook. Nor am I saying that QPRs and Alterous attraction are things only an extra-dimensional god can understand. Instead, what I want people to think about is the consequences of not knowing terms like this. There's a loneliness that comes from the experience of feeling or wanting something that is so incredibly rare and unknown. And when a person finally finds it, it can be something that they latch onto out of fear of losing it, because if they do, what are the chances they'll find it again? And Bill takes advantage of that fear. The fear that this is a once-in-a-lifetime chance and that Ford will never get something like this again. Someone who understands him in the same way Bill does. Fordsy, nobody really gets you, do they? Without me, you'll always feel unseen, surrounded by dolts who don't even recognize your full potential. You've always felt alone in a crowd, haven't you? Who else will give you this feeling again? Even if you got rid of me, you'd miss me. Admit it, you'd miss me. Bill preys on Ford's loneliness and isolates him from his social network, which is basically just one person, so it's not that hard, by telling him that Fiddleford is untrustworthy and won't follow through on the portal, and he derides Ford when he feels as if Ford isn't committing himself to his work. Hey, I'm not the one skipping portal work to carouse with a third-wheel hillbilly with second thoughts about our project. And let's talk about that work aspect, shall we? After Fiddleford leaves the project, Ford catches on pretty quickly to what Bill had planned from the start, and realizes that he was just using him as a means to take over the world. Now, there are two ways to interpret Bill's actions moving forward in Arrow Ace reading, through a Queerplatonic or Alterous lens, or through a work lens. With the QPR reading, we get more of what we had before. Bill talks about the people who've betrayed or left Ford in his life and tries to convince him that Bill is the only functional relationship he'll ever have, the only relationship that wouldn't eventually leave him behind. But let's take a look at Bill's actions through the lens of work. Ford has been valuing his work life over his social life ever since that night when Stan was kicked out. It's what he can rely on, what he feels wouldn't leave him behind. It's what will make him great. The freak returns a hero. But here's the thing about committing your life to your work and not building a stable support network. It's not really that sustainable. Even without an evil demon triangle and the threat of the end of the world, Ford's work was going to eat him alive eventually. His work ethic just couldn't last, he'd eventually burn out. And with this interpretation in mind, Bill could easily serve as a representation of what happens to a person when they let their work consume them. How he has to constantly stay awake with cups of coffee so that Bill won't enter his mind. How because of Bill, his body isn't his own and he wakes up feeling physically awful. Bill enabled Ford's workaholic tendencies and his association of his work with his self-worth, and the effects were dire. He convinces Ford that without him, without his work, he would be nothing. The hillbilly abandoned you. Your father won't want you returning without millions. You have no friends, and even if you died out here in the snow, who would even miss you? The feeling that your work is the only thing that gives you worth is one that can stem from how society treats Arrow Ace people. Like I said before, society tends to see your career as the only life you could possibly have if you don't have a romance or sex life. It can also feel like the only reliable thing you can hold on to if friendships are unstable because of the prioritization of romance. And Ford takes this to heart. He still can't let go of his work. The journals are what contain all the information Bill needs to take over the world, and reasonably, he should destroy them. But he just can't do it.
I have stared at the fire, journals in hand, for hours. I just can't do it. The knowledge in here could be a gift to mankind. The portal's potential limitlessness.
He can't get rid of the research he worked so hard for. It's all that he is. And so after falling out with Bill, Ford calls Stan for help. This is the first time these two men have seen each other since they were teenagers, and a lot is riding on this reunion. Obviously, Stan is desperate to have Ford back in his life after a life of crime and scamming people has gotten into more trouble than he can handle. Stan hasn't been doing too well for himself in terms of interpersonal relationships, as much as Ford would think otherwise, and he desperately wants the human connection he had from back when he was a kid. But Ford's not in the headspace to think about that. From his perspective, his research is about to doom the world, and his toxic situationship is literally torturing him. Ford tells him to take the journal far away, and Stan doesn't take it too well.
That's it? You finally want to see me after 10 years, and it's to tell me to get as far away from you as possible?
Tensions rise, the two brothers throw out their grievances that they've been harboring ever since that fateful night, and they fight. And let's talk about this fight, because this fight is more than just a fight between two brothers. It's a fight of two ideologies. Stan is angry at Ford for abandoning him that night, closing the curtains when their father threw him out. He's angry at Ford for abandoning his family for his work and his stupid mysteries. He's angry at Ford for leaving him behind.
You left me behind, you jerk! It was supposed to be us forever! You ruined my life!
And of course Ford has his reasons for acting the way he does. He's trying to stop the world from ending. But hey, this is an Arrow Ace reading of Ford, not Stan. He's gonna be the one on trial today. And if we reinterpret Ford's desire to be a great scientist as his desire to not be left behind by a society he thinks would do so in a heartbeat because of his inability to have romantic relationships, then Stan's words here are heartbreaking because Ford has essentially betrayed himself. Betrayed his heart. The whole reason why he wanted to find this whole grand unifying theory of weirdness, the reason he summoned Bill in the first place is because he wanted people to accept him and to love him. And here is a person who would do anything to have Ford back in his life, who wants nothing more than to be friends again. But Ford was just so laser focused on his work as the one thing that would give him this acceptance he craves that he's become blind to his actual social connections, even before Stan came back. The reason why this fight starts in the first place is because Ford won't let his journals get burned. And at this point, it's too late. Ford's been consumed by his work, and it's the only thing he can think about because he now knows that the stakes are so much higher. There isn't room for anything else, not even his family. And so...
You care more about your dumb mysteries than your family? Well then you can have them! Whoa, hey, what's going on? Hey, Stanford!
Stanley, help me!
Oh no, what do I do?
Stanley, do something!
So yeah, because of Ford's inability to reconcile with his brother, he ends up getting sucked into the portal. Now here he is, at Bill's mercy. So after all this, all of his failures, after his only friend left and his work ate him alive, after failing to connect with his brother again, what does he do now? After all of Ford's failed relationships, Stanley's supposed betrayal, Fiddleford leaving, Bill's actual betrayal, and then finally Stan pushing him into the portal, Ford is unable to trust anyone anymore. The mantra "trust no one" that we see so prominently in the show was written by Ford himself, right after Bill betrayed him and instilled the idea in Ford's head. I already talked about how romance is commonly prioritized over friendships and how that can affect how Arrow Ace people see relationships. And the lack of trust that Ford has for basically anyone, coming from a lifetime of what he sees as betrayals, is something that can be attributed to that insecurity. But moving forward, once Ford was sucked into the portal, he was immediately on the run from Bill and his goons, and he replaced his old work goal of his grand unifying theory of weirdness with a new work goal, killing God. Hey, might as well dream big. Now, we have to take into account the build-up Ford had of becoming the great scientist who would join the ranks of mutant. This was his goal for so long, and he failed. The grand unifying theory of weirdness doesn't exist. It was just a trick Bill came up with to manipulate him. And because of how he relied on his work as what would give him his worth, this probably would have devastated his self-esteem. Let's say you're an Arrow Ace person and you've decided to put all your money on your career because circumstances have made it hard for you to trust friendships. This is the one thing you can rely on, the one thing that will give you an into society, the one thing that informs your self-worth. And then you trip over a walnut, do a 360 spin as you flail in the air and explode at the bottom of a cliff. And you also doom the world and stuff. That's not gonna feel too good. Right after Ford realized Bill deceived him, and before he calls Stan, he says this in the journal.
After that, all there is to do is wait for Stanley and save the world. Or lose my life in the effort.
Or lose his life in the effort. When we take a look at the journal and Ford's mindset after Bill's betrayal, we realize that Ford has become absolutely laser-focused on defeating Bill and fixing his mistakes, at the cost of his own well-being.
I might never see home again, but at least I could save the multiverse from his wrath and wreak vengeance for the life he stole from me.
Ford accepts that he'll never see home again pretty quickly and dedicates the next 30 years to defeating Bill. He becomes attached to the idea of himself as the lone hero. And this is probably due to the guilt he feels for bringing Bill into this world, but also the shame he feels for failing the one thing he was supposed to succeed at. It's almost a form of self-punishment. And this goal to kill Bill, it's really not too different from the grand unifying theory of weirdness goal. It's another goal that he's putting all his eggs into, all his self-worth into. It's just that now he's a lot more self-destructive about it. And after 3 decades of hunting down Bill, Ford finally corners him in the Nightmare Realm. He's about to pull the trigger, end Bill for good. But there was a certain episode of Gravity Falls happening at this point in time. It's called Not What He Seems. And so the portal reactivates and Ford has to get through the portal before Bill does. I'm sure Ford took Stanley interfering with his goal that he's been working towards for 30 years, very calmly and peacefully. And it's now that we finally get to the events of the series. Yeah, 14 pages into the script and we finally get to the events of the actual TV show that this character is from. But now's a good time to take a look at Ford as we meet him in the show and what his arc is about. At this point in time, Ford has spent 30 years in the sci-fi sideburn dimension, and he's become used to a life of isolation and work.
The life before me is one of constant solitary vigilance against the unimaginable insanity that is Bill Cipher. I brought him into this dimension, and I'll take him out if it's the last thing I do.
He doesn't trust anyone, especially not his brother, and he's still dead set on his goal of becoming the hero that defeats Bill. And after 30 years of being like this, being the lone hero, who could really expect this elderly man to change? Who could possibly get this man to let go of the image of himself as a great scientist or lone hero? Who could possibly begin to let this jaded man open up and trust someone for the first time in years? How about a 12-year-old with undiagnosed anxiety? In the episode right after Tale of Two Stands, Dungeons, Dungeons, and More Dungeons, Dipper is looking for someone to play basically D&D with him, but no one in the shack is willing to do it on account of it being too nerdy. Except for Seuss, who's just a different flavor of nerd.
To my grandma's backyard!
That is until Dipper accidentally falls into Ford's basement and...
Wait, is that a 38-sided die from Dungeons, Dungeons, and More Dungeons?
Yeah, he's also a huge nerd. I could never relate to that. Now, there's a lot of content in Gravity Falls focused on showing off how similar Ford and Dipper are. They both have birth defects, they're both in love with mysteries and cryptids, they're both awkward and have trouble making social connections. Hell, they even both mistake Seuss's name for Zeus when they first meet him. And Ford recognizes how similar they are.
I always thought I was the odd member of the family, but perhaps I truly have found a kindred spirit. I presumed that there was no one on this earth who I could consider an ally and friend. I may have been wrong.
The fact that they are able to bond over something they both find fun and find solace in knowing that there is someone in the shack similar to them is probably very important to both of them, but especially Ford, who has spent his entire life being bullied for being different and has repeatedly been betrayed and abandoned by the few people he connected with. And especially considering how alone Ford has been for the past 30 years. Dipper is the first real friend he's made since Fiddleford, and despite everything, despite the trust no ones and the self-isolation and the laser focusing on defeating Bill and becoming this great hero, he still wants to make connections. He can't help himself.
I guess we've both gone for a while without a friend.
One of the main stereotypes about aromantic and asexual people is that they are people who don't feel emotions as much as other people do, that don't love as much as other people do, that because romantic and or sexual attraction isn't something they can feel, somehow the rest of their emotions are depleted or something. And I don't know, one of the reasons why I like seeing Ford as Aro Ace is because he so clearly loves his family. His main story arc in the show is partially about building a community of people he can trust. And that kind of arc, through the lens of being Aro Ace, feels important, showing that an Aro Ace person can, and should, and will form communities of people who support them and love them for who they are. And who better of a person to kickstart that arc than a person who Ford feels is just as weird as he is. Now, I'm not going to try and read Dipper as Aro Ace. I think there's substantially less stuff there to read for his character in that regard. But I do think that through an Arrow-Ace lens, the fact that Ford is able to connect with someone who's just as weird as he is can be read as an allegory for finding people of the same identity as you. I mentioned earlier in the video in the Fiddleford section how important friendships are as an Arrow-Ace person, considering how unstable support systems can be if you don't have some sort of romantic partner. And so finding someone who's a lot like you in ways you didn't expect can really help make a friendship feel more secure and trustworthy. It doesn't mean that Arrow-Ace people can't form friendships with people who aren't exactly like them, but there's a little less fear of being left behind when you feel like your friend can understand you and where you're coming from. And with all of this in mind, it makes the fact that Ford, Mr. Trust No One, explicitly tells Dipper that he trusts him really impactful.
In my time, I've made many powerful enemies, but I trust you with this secret.
Trust is a big factor in friendships as an Arrow-Ace person. Like I said, because of the ways in which society prioritizes romance, there's a looming fear that your friends will eventually leave you behind for their romantic partners. And so with the friendships you do have, in order for the friendship to function, there needs to be a certain level of trust involved. Trust that the other person won't leave you behind. This is the trust that Ford thought Fiddleford betrayed way back when he left the Portal Project, and that made it so much harder to make friendships going forward. And it's why it's so important that Ford trusts Dipper. Granted, Dipper is a child, and Ford probably wouldn't be feeling that much fear of abandonment as one of his guardians, but forming these friendships is still important, and it will be the first step to creating a more stable support system through his family. However, Ford still isn't perfect. He's still not willing to trust anyone other than Dipper, which is why he tells him not to tell anyone, not even Mabel, about the dimensional rift that Bill could use as a gateway into their world, which indirectly leads to the apocalypse. And he's still laser focused on his goal to stop Bill's cipher, like he was when he first entered the portal. He's still focused on being the lone hero who would defeat Bill, because Ford is a person who places his self-worth on his work. But here's the thing, Dipper didn't bond with Ford because he was a great scientist or something. Sure, that's why he looks up to him and it's the source of a lot of admiration, but the very first bonding moment they had, the one that kickstarted their friendship, was when they got to play a game they liked together. When for the first time since he got there, Ford put his work aside and spent time with his grandnephew. Ford's accomplishments are what caused Dipper to be so intrigued by him, but that wouldn't really have meant anything if Ford was just a dick. Dipper likes Ford as a person because he's fun and nerdy and cool. I haven't mentioned Ford and Mabel's relationship that much throughout this section, because unfortunately they don't really have that much screen time together in the show, but obviously they love each other too. And again, Mabel doesn't like Ford as a person because he was the great scientist that proved the unifying theory of weirdness. She likes him because he's a good guy who lets a 12-year-old go on a mission to steal unicorn hair with a crossbow. Actually, maybe I called the good guy card too soon. But my point still stands. The kids love him anyway. They risk everything to save him from Bill during Weirdmageddon. It's great that Ford wants to be a hero, but he never needed to be one to earn the love of his family. And speaking of family... So, let's set the scene for Weirdmageddon Part 3. Dipper, Mabel, Fiddleford, and the rest of the townsfolk are all ganging up to fight Bill and rescue Ford. But there's one man who isn't having any of it.
I hope you enjoy kissing the butt of a bunch of fascists living in an emerald city like a loser.
Stan is still mad at Ford for not thanking him after saving him from the portal, and so he's not super psyched to save his brother. Now, let's take a closer look at their relationship as it is at this point in the show. The core of Stan and Ford's relationship is that one feels like he was never good enough, and the other felt like he had to be good enough. Through an Arrow-Ace reading, I've given my perspective on why Ford always felt like he had to be good enough, but this is what their relationship is even within the text. And this leaks into Part 3 of Weirdmageddon. Stan is unwilling to be the hero and thinks he's a screw-up. Hell, he's mad because he wanted to be acknowledged for doing something good for once. And Ford feels like he needs to be the hero. Like it says in the journal, he's not being able to get over the idea of himself as the lone hero. And this is why he feels like he has to get that last word in at the Zodiac Circle. The Grammar Stanley moment is an encapsulation of both of their biggest flaws in their relationship. Ford needs to be the best and get the last word in, while Stan can't take the L because he's insecure. And after this confrontation costs them their chance to defeat Bill and puts the kids in danger, it's only here that they're finally able to actually talk to each other. And it's this conversation that allows them to finally work through their issues. As they talk, Ford says this.
Don't blame yourself. I'm the one who made a deal with Bill in the first place. I fell for all his easy flattery. You would have seen him for the scam artist he is.
Now let's put the Arrow Ace glasses on. Ford can never own up to not living up to his own insane expectations because his intellect, his career, was his lifeline. He spent years cultivating this insecurity that his self-worth was tied to his accomplishments, whether it was joining the likes of Newton or defeating Bill. As mentioned before, there's a pressure to excel in your accomplishments as that is seen as the only other life you can have if romance is off the table. And here is basically the first time Ford allows Stan to have something. He says, "You would have been better than me at this." From an Arrow Ace perspective, he's finally admitting that he was bad at something, when being good at something was what he thought was the only thing that would give him value in a world that prioritized something he was never capable of. So blah blah blah, Bill comes back with the kids, threatens to kill them if Ford doesn't let him into his mind. Ford agrees, and whoopsie daisy, Ford and Stan, in twin fashion, switch their clothes and Ford erases Stan's mind, along with Bill's cipher with the memory gun. This moment is pretty significant for Stan, as someone who thought he was a screw-up his whole life and spent the whole episode refusing to be a hero. But for Ford, the moment when he lets Stan be the hero instead of him is when he truly lets go of the idea of being the lone hero, the idea that he needed to be the one to sacrifice himself. In helping Stan, he's able to accept not being the best at something. It is only here when he finally lets go of the need to be great.
If I'm totally honest, I must admit that Stan's a hero, and I'm a hero's brother. And I'm okay with that.
Stan has no idea, but he did it. He saved the world. He saved me. You're our hero, Stanley.
Now, obviously Stan gets his memory back. In spite of everything, this is a kid's show. After repeated exposure to his summer memories, Stan is able to fully recover, and the two brothers are able to go on the adventure that they always dreamed of. So, to summarize, what is Ford's story through an Arrow Ace lens? Well, it's a story about growing up feeling abnormal and ostracized from society. It's a story about realizing how difficult building stable support systems can be in a world that prioritizes romance and sees romantic relationships as one of the only kind of relationships that will last. It's about the fear of being left behind and doing anything to make sure that the world won't forget about you. It's about diving headfirst into your work and eventually seeing it as the only thing that gives you worth. It's about queerplatonic relationships and Alterous love, and how people can take advantage of the rarity of those relationships. But above all else, it's about finding a community of people you can trust, who love you for who you are, and about learning to let go of the need to be great. But with all that being said, what does Ford's story mean for Arrow Ace people? What does this mean for us? When I first finished Gravity Falls all those years ago, one of the main questions in my mind was, what was the true grand unifying theory of weirdness? Where did it all come from? The show itself doesn't really provide an answer, and I didn't really know the answer until I read Journal 3 for myself. In the journal, Ford takes Dipper to the town border of Gravity Falls and shows him a bag of jelly beans, with one of them being a bit oddly shaped, the odd one of the bunch. He rolls them down a hill, and as the other uniformly shaped jelly beans tumbled downhill, the odd one rolled up, back into Gravity Falls. Weird things just happen in life. We as humans constructed the things we deemed as normal, but every once in a while something comes along that doesn't fit that construction. And those weird things, the outcasts, misshapen jelly beans, the six-fingered scientists and nerds with constellations on their foreheads, are gravitated to Gravity Falls. And we as audience members are the same. How many people in the Gravity Falls fandom were sucked into this world and these characters because they understood what it was like to feel weird and different? And how many people in the Gravity Falls fandom are queer themselves? Gravity Falls is a weirdest magnet indeed. And even without looking at it through a queer lens, Gravity Falls is about accepting our differences and embracing our weirdness. It's about finding a community who accepts us for who we are. Ford never needed to prove himself. His obsession with his work was born out of a fear of what he'd be without it. But no matter what his dad, or his principal, or the world said about him, no matter what his bullies told him, no matter how much the world said he was different, or weird, or a freak, he was always enough. He didn't need to be the great scientist that proved the grand unifying theory of weirdness, or the great hero that stopped Bill, in order to be enough. Sometimes, finding people who know you for who you are, and accept you anyways, is enough to get through life. Being Arrow Ace can be hard. The society we live in wasn't built for Arrow Ace identities. It wasn't built with people like us in mind. But that doesn't mean that we can't find ways to be happy. Sometimes it feels like the world is going to leave you behind, forget you exist. But building a community of people who accept you for who you are, whilst hard, isn't impossible. Trust shouldn't be given out unconditionally. But I'm happy to say that there are people in my life who I do trust. It doesn't mean I don't feel scared sometimes, but that trust in others has gotten me far. And despite what people say, romance or sex is not the missing piece that will complete someone. This is true for Arrow Ace people, but also for everyone.
Bill may tell you that happiness requires conquering galaxies and living forever. But I've seen enough of the universe to tell you that he's wrong. I found my happiness, and it looks like this.
Is Stanford actually Arrow Ace? I don't know. If we're going with the intent of the writers, probably not. Hell, Alex Hirsch probably didn't even know what aromanticism or asexuality was when he was writing it, let alone what QPRs and Alterous attraction was. And if Fiddleford really was a QPR, then it probably wouldn't have been the best first impression to give to an audience. But Ford's story is one that deeply resonated with me anyway, and I think that's what matters most. And to any aromantic, asexual, anyone who falls on the spectrum who may be watching this video, it's okay. You're okay. You don't have to be Isaac Newton to be worthy of acceptance and love. In the words of a wise, and maybe Arrow Ace man, stay curious, stay weird, stay kind, and don't let anyone ever tell you you aren't smart, or brave, or worthy enough.
Why did you make me do this? You're fighting so you can watch everyone around you die.